The Genesis narrative of creation has thus far brought into existence, in the following order, light, a bubble-like firmament in the midst of primordial waters, the earth's seas, land, plants, including grass, herbs, and fruit trees, the sun, moon, stars, and other planets firmly fixed in the aforementioned firmament, placed there as lights for the earth and for signs and for seasons. In every case, Genesis has been wrong in its description of creation against what we know from modern science. On day 5 of creation, we'll have another opportunity to see if Genesis can get something right. Within 48 hours of the earth and seas having been formed under a dome for the sky, God creates all the world's water creatures, including whales, and He also creates the birds. As of yet, however, land animals have not appeared on the dry earth. But is this what science has discovered? It's hardly surprising now to find out no. We know from scientific studies that life indeed likely arose in the seas, but this is hardly what Genesis is suggesting. We've already learned that Genesis has claimed plant life was formed, grass, herbs, and fruit trees, on the 3rd day of creation. It is only now, on the 5th day, that the author of the biblical story turns his attention to life in the seas. And the claim is not that the early forms of life scientists believe first inhabited the seas were created on this day. The author specifically mentions whales. Were he to have merely mentioned sea life in general, those eager to rescue the Bible from the clutches of modern skepticism may have stood a better chance in deflecting the criticism leveled at the ancient tale. But he didn't. The Genesis author specifically penned whales in his narrative, and this takes all credibility away from the creation account. Whales, like their cousins the orca and dolphin, are warm-blooded mammals, not anything like the fish with whom they share the watery depths. Modern scientific research has discovered that whales and dolphins are descended, via the process of evolution, from a common land-dwelling ancestor.
Nature reports the discovery of a crucial missing link in the ancestry of the cetaceans, porpoises, dolphins, and whales.
Ever since the time of Darwin, scientists have known that whales were descended from land mammals. But until very recently, about 15 years ago, the ancestors of whales were not known, and creationists had a field day because there were no intermediates. In the last 15 years then, a number of remarkable transitional forms have been found that document the transition and the morphology of these early whales very nicely. One such form is Cuchicites. Cuchicites is about 45 million years old, and as you see from the skeleton, it had a long tail and relatively short legs. It was an animal well adapted to swim in water. Before Cuchicites lived Ambulocetus. Ambulocetus is about 49 million years old, and it lived in nearshore marine seas in Pakistan. Its habit were probably sort of like a crocodile. And then, discovered most recently in 2001, is the skeleton of Pachycetus, the first known whale, which didn't look anything like a whale. It really looked like a wolf or so if you would see it in a zoo. However, we know that this was already an aquatic animal because of the structure of its bones. They are very dense. This was probably an animal that was wading in shallow water. It was not a swimmer. What was missing at this point was the link to the land relatives of whales. And with our new Nature paper, we think we have found it. And that link is endohyus, which I have been studying with Mark Clemens, Sunil Bajpai, B.N. Tiwari, and Lisa Cooper. I think the most exciting moment came when my technician was preparing the skull, and he by accident broke the ear off, and he was ready to glue it back, and he showed it to me, and I realized that on the broken surface of this ear you could see that the inside of the bone was very thick, just like a whale and not like any other land mammal.
My contribution to this study was to actually look at the bone structure, specifically of the bones of the limbs. And when we look at the bones of endohyus, in general, they look just like a regular terrestrial mammal, a mammal that was walking on land. But when we look at the thicknesses of the bones, that's when the whole story changes. The bones of hecha were actually extremely thick. This is the kind of thing that we see in animals like hippopotamus that live almost entirely in the water. Although they can walk on land, their skeleton has changed that allows them to basically walk on the bottom of a river bottom.
Mark Clements of the University of Wyoming has added an analysis of both oxygen and carbon isotopes in the teeth of hecha, providing further evidence of the amphibious life of this animal. So the new species hecha helps bridge a 10 million year gap in the fossil record.
And, in order to have evolved from a land-dwelling ancestor, there would have had to have been land-dwelling animals long before one found its way back into the sea. And not just any animal, but a mammal, a creature developed long down the evolutionary path from the first life forms to have colonized the dry earth. In a minor effort to rescue the biblical tale, some may object to the fact that the original Hebrew of Genesis doesn't specifically state that whales were formed on the fifth day of creation. Indeed, the Hebrew translated as whale in the King James Version is tiene. Tiene is used in a variety of verses throughout Scripture, and it is true that it isn't always translated as whale. It could be argued that there was no specific word for whale in the Hebrew language. However, to argue this invites further trouble for the biblical text, as the alternative translations for tiene in the KJV are serpent and, far worse, dragon or monster. The New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, however, interprets this word differently. In a number of verses where the King James Version has dragons, the NRSV and several other modern English translations have jackals. This is likely because the Hebrew for jackal is tan, and to make this plural, Hebrew adds the suffix "im," making tanim, which is extremely similar to tanin. However, in the immediate textual context of Genesis, jackal is hardly the correct word choice, and thus the NRSV and many other translations choose sea monster instead. Other translations, such as the NIV, try to skirt the difficult passage by merely using great creatures of the sea or great sea beasts instead. However, whale may not be far from the original author's intent, as these great sea creatures were often mistaken to be monsters of the deep, even by experienced sailors in antiquity. If the best that can be said regarding this passage from the biblical tale of creation is that we do not know which specific creature was intended by the original author, our own ignorance hardly rescues Genesis from every other detail. In the next episode of this video series, we will examine closely the other animal Genesis claims was formed on the fifth day of creation, the birds. If the author of Genesis lost credibility naming whales among the sea creatures formed on day 5, will we learn that he lost all reliability in naming birds as their companion creations?